In the United States, a routine hospital visit can cost more than a luxury vacation to Europe. A broken arm can result in a $5,000 bill. A single overnight stay for observation can easily escalate to $30,000 or more. Most people assume this happens because modern medicine is complex or simply because doctors are greedy. But the reality is far more clinical and, frankly, far more calculated. Almost every exorbitant cost we see in the U.S. healthcare system today can be traced back to a single decision. One specific law, passed decades ago, that quietly redesigned the foundations of the entire industry. This wasn't a calculation error. It was a fundamental shift in the rules of the game. This law altered how hospitals bill, how insurance companies operate, and most importantly, how you, the patient, end up footing the bill. Once you understand how the strings are pulled behind that statement you receive in the mail, you will never look at a hospital the same way again. Welcome to the story of the law that broke American healthcare. To understand why the current system is a financial black hole, we first need to travel back to a time when things actually made sense. In the 1950s and early 60s, healthcare in America was surprisingly affordable. Back then, the relationship was direct, doctor and patient. Most people paid their doctors out of pocket for common services. Hospitals functioned much like any other local business. They had simple, visible, and, crucially, transparent pricing. If you needed an X-ray, you knew the price before you walked through the door. Health insurance did exist, of course, but its purpose was radically different. It was catastrophic insurance. It was designed for major emergencies, major surgeries, or unforeseen accidents, not to cover a prescription for antibiotics or a yearly checkup. In this ecosystem, prices remained stable because there was real competition. If a hospital charged too much, the patient simply went to the provider down the street. But by the mid-60s, the landscape began to shift. Medical technology advanced, hospitals expanded, and operating costs began to creep up. The government saw a looming problem regarding access for the elderly, and they decided to intervene. But the solution they chose planted the seeds for the disaster we live with today. The year is 1965. President Lyndon B. Johnson signs a historic piece of legislation that most today know as Medicare and Medicaid. On paper, it was a humanitarian triumph. The goal was noble, ensuring that the elderly and low-income citizens weren't left behind by medical progress. However, the devil was in the details of how the government would pay for this service. To get hospitals and doctors to agree to participate in this new federal program, the government had to make a concession that would change the DNA of the American economy. Instead of negotiating fixed prices or encouraging competition, the government agreed to reimburse hospitals based on their reasonable costs. Essentially, the hospital would submit a bill for what it cost them to treat the patient, and the government would add a small profit margin and pay it, no questions asked. At that exact moment, the incentive to save money vanished. For the first time in history, a hospital didn't make money by being efficient. They made money by spending more. It was the start of a financial arms race where the sky was the limit because the payer, the government, had infinite pockets. Think about this from a business perspective. If you run a company and someone promises to pay you back for absolutely everything you spend, plus a guaranteed margin, what would you do? You'd spend as much as humanly possible. American hospitals did exactly what any rational entity would do. They began to spend massively. If they bought a more expensive MRI machine, the reimbursement was higher. If they built a new wing with marble floors and luxury waiting rooms, the government covered the investment. This created an explosion of infrastructure, but it also created an explosion of bureaucracy. Because every penny had to be justified to receive that reimbursement, hospitals began hiring thousands of administrators. In fact, between 1970 and 2010, the number of physicians in the U.S. grew by 150%. But the number of healthcare administrators grew by a staggering 3,200%. The system stopped focusing on curing people at the lowest possible cost and started focusing on managing billing codes. Prices were no longer determined by the market. They were determined by complex mathematical formulas and closed-door negotiations between massive institutions. The patient, who used to be the primary customer, was pushed to the side, becoming a mere formality for the flow of money from the payer to the provider. But the explosion of costs didn't just stay within the hospital walls. It began to bleed into the entire American labor market. Historically, health insurance became tied to employment during World War II due to wage freezes. But the 1965 law solidified this bond in a way that distorted the economy forever. Think about job lock. Millions of Americans stay in jobs they hate or avoid starting their own businesses simply because they are terrified of losing their corporate healthcare plan. In a true free market, labor is mobile. But in the U.S., healthcare costs have turned insurance into a form of modern-day feudalism. Corporations now spend an average of $15,000 to $20,000 per year, per employee, just on premiums. That is money that could have been corporate profit, or better yet, higher salaries for workers. Every dollar that goes to a healthcare administrator is a dollar that doesn't go into the pocket of the American middle class. This is where we enter the twilight zone of medical billing, the infamous Chargemaster. Every hospital in the United States maintains a secret, massive price list containing thousands of items. It is, quite literally, a work of financial science fiction. In a Chargemaster, a single sterile gauze pad might be listed at $15, even though it costs 10 cents at a pharmacy. A bag of IV saline, essentially salt water, can be billed at $500. Why are these prices so absurd? Because they aren't real prices. They are starting points for a negotiation. Large insurance companies look at that $500 price and say, "We'll give you $50." And the hospital accepts it. It's a choreographed dance where both parties pretend a massive discount is taking place. But what happens if you don't have insurance? This is where the 1965 legacy shows its cruelest face. If you are an individual without the backing of a major corporation, the hospital will send you a bill based on those Chargemaster prices. They will charge you the full $500 for the saline. The system became so complex that even the doctors themselves often have no idea what the items they prescribe actually cost. A veil of opacity was created where no one knows the real price of anything until the bill arrives in the mail weeks after the treatment is over. At this point, the question is obvious. If the system is this inefficient and painful for the citizen, who is actually winning? The short answer is everyone standing between the doctor and the patient. Hospitals have transformed into real estate and financial giants with budgets that rival small cities. Insurance companies have moved from being simple risk managers to becoming the true gatekeepers of healthcare, deciding which treatments you receive based on their profit margins. And we cannot forget Big Pharma. They know that because of the insurance structure created by this system, they can raise prices on vital medications, like insulin, because the patient isn't the one paying the sticker price directly. The insurance company pays it and then simply raises your monthly premium the following year. It is a vicious cycle of wealth transfer. Every time the cost goes up, the middlemen take a percentage of an increasingly larger pie. It is a system designed for value extraction, not clinical efficiency. In an emergency, you can't comparison shop. You're at the mercy of a system that knows perfectly well you will pay anything to stay alive. From an economic standpoint, we also have to talk about moral hazard. This is a term finance experts use to describe when one party takes a risk because they know someone else will bear the cost. Because of the way the 1965 law and subsequent insurance regulations were written, the customer, the patient, is completely decoupled from the price. When you go to a restaurant, you look at the right side of the menu to see the prices. In U.S. healthcare, there is no right side of the menu. This lack of price sensitivity allows providers to perform unnecessary tests and procedures, knowing that the patient won't complain because insurance covers it. But as we know in finance, there is no such thing as a free lunch. You pay for those free tests through higher premiums, higher taxes, and a lower standard of living. We have built a system where the buyer doesn't care about the price and the seller has every incentive to inflate it. It is the perfect recipe for a permanent inflationary spiral. If all of this sounds so terrible, why hasn't it been fixed? The reality is that healthcare now represents nearly 20% of the entire U.S. economy. It is, quite literally, too big to fail. Every time a politician proposes a reform to lower prices, they run into the most powerful lobby in the world. Hospitals argue that if prices are cut, they'll have to close emergency rooms. Insurance companies claim that the quality of care will plummet. Pharmaceutical companies insist that innovation will grind to a halt. Any attempt to return to the transparency of the 1950s threatens the revenue of millions of people and multi-billion-dollar corporations. The system isn't maintained because it's good or because it produces the best health outcomes in the world. In fact, the U.S. ranks lower than many developed nations in life expectancy. It is maintained because it is incredibly profitable for those who control it. Ultimately, the American healthcare system is the result of a 1965 law that, with the best of intentions, broke the basic incentives of economics. By removing the link between cost and value, we created a bureaucratic monster that prioritizes billing over well-being. The next time you open a hospital envelope and feel that pit in your stomach at a 4- or 5-figure bill for a simple procedure, remember this. That bill isn't a reflection of the medicine you received. It is the cost of maintaining a machinery that was never designed to be affordable. It was designed to spend. And until the rules of the game change, we will all continue to pay the price. Thanks for watching.